probably have to start with videos of slug sex. Otherwise, all of you are going to be disappointed. Of course, I could hold it till the very end, but you know, it is a talk on ISHQ, so let's start with a bang, so to speak.
So all these animals, having left the sea, solved the problems of moving around and breathing air in their own differing ways. But there was another difficulty: mating. In the sea, animals need only release their eggs and sperm, and the water mix the two together. On dry land, that couldn't happen, even for the most moisture-loving of creatures. An individual slug carries both male and female organs, but even then, that was of no help. Each had to both give and receive. Somehow or other, pairs of individuals had to get together, and the ways they have evolved in which to do so are quite extraordinary. Indeed, some of them are almost beyond imagining. The leopard slug, you might think, has the simplest of habits. Maybe, but not when it comes to mating. When an individual is looking for a partner, it gives its trail of slime a special taste that advertises the fact. Another, if it feels the same way, will detect the invitation and start to follow. The pursuer, to confirm that it's there and ready to mate, gives the pursued a nibble. The leader heads upwards. An overhang is what's needed. The underside of a branch will do very nicely. The two start to circle one another more and more closely until they entwine. For an hour or so, they continue to wind themselves around one another. Then, suddenly, the pair release their hold on the branch and start to slide downwards on a rope of mucus. Now, in mid-air, they move to the next stage in their pairing. Each everts its male organ from just behind its head. These grow longer and longer. Then they too begin to entwine. They fan out to form a translucent, flower-like globe. And now, at last, sperm passes from one slug to the other. The transfer is complete. Each has been fertilized. Finally, their strange balletic relationship comes to an end with a bump.
This, I think, sort of represents everything about how sex can be had. That would be an improvement in the way we have sex now. It would be such fun to have sex mid-air and to not be constrained by gravity.
That's true.
It would be such fun to have sort of not just lube in certain parts of our bodies, but all over, I think. Although some people may disagree. And it would be great fun to have each organism or each partner in the couple be both male and female, and to fertilize each other, and to have prehensile penises. I think that's sort of on the top of my wish list. So there are a lot of ways in which animals have sex, and animals do gender and perform gender, which are, startling and surprising. And I probably know about, tiny fraction, and we as human beings probably know very little of what's out there. But I'll give you a flavor of what I know, not too much. And it's not going to be a very information sort of heavy talk, because eventually I do want to move towards the queer movement and some of the implications some of this might have for the queer movement. And I'll try not to linger too much, because once I get started talking about animal sex, I tend to keep going. So just stop me if I'm looking like I'm too carried away. Okay, so we're done with the slug sex. Slugs, like a lot of invertebrates, are actually both male and female, and so they produce sperm and they produce eggs. So in the video that you saw, the two males and females, right, because each animal is both, stuck out their penises at each other, and the penises were prehensile, and so they wound around each other, and then they flattened as much as possible against each other so that maximum surface area, and then they fertilized each other, and then with no strings attached, they plopped away from each other. So hermaphroditism, as it's called, or the practice of being having both male and female organs, or to put it more biologically precisely, to produce both what could be called sperm and eggs, because it's a little hard to decide what is a male organ and what is a female organ, is actually probably more common than the practice of having two genders, if one were to include the entire living world. Plants, for example, are mostly male and female. All of you who've done the flower dissection, because at least when I was in school, we weren't allowed to dissect animals, so we had to dissect flowers. And so all of you will have seen flowers with their stamens and their pistils. And those of you who had to miss out on flower dissections when you were in school, you can just go outside and find a flower. And most flowers will have both, although some will have only one. In addition, a lot of invertebrates have both male and female gametes, or sort of sperm and ova, as we like to call them in humans. And the advantage of having both is some animals, but not all, mate with themselves if they cannot find someone else, which is, it's not, self-reproduction is not the same as self-service. I don't know if it's as gratifying to, fertilize yourself as it is to service yourself, but it is an option that enables sexual reproduction in case you don't find someone else, which may not be as complex a social process as it is with humans, but can also just be, you're wandering around in the world, when do you bump into into somebody else? This is an example of a fish, which is also hermaphroditic, like a very large number of fish. This is not just about invertebrates. Several fish are also hermaphroditic, and there are also fish which show, and reptiles, and pretty much mammals are the ones who I think have gotten really boring compared to the range of possibilities out there. But lizards and reptiles too, as you'll see, have a certain possibility of gender fluidity that we don't, in as large numbers. All right. So this is a hamlet, which is both, which sort of has both male and female traits, but there are more interesting fish than that. We know that there are several animals that are called hermaphroditic, which have both male and female gamete production, as we call it. But this is a blue-headed wrasser, and these fish actually have 3 types, right? So there are fish that are born male and produce sperm all their lives. There are fish that are born female and produce sperm. produce eggs all of their lives. And there are fish that are born female and become male and transition to becoming male at some point in their lives. And there are very complex fish society dynamics between all three of these genders, if you will have them, or rather sexes. The blue headed is one of the few examples that we have of fish that transition into multiple stable sex types over the course of their lives. Remember the Dory? Yes, Finding Nemo. So paradoxically, the clownfish is also a fish that gender transitions, and clownfish don't have these sort of stable multiple types of genders. Clownfish are much more flexible. And so, as you can see, they live between the fronds of anemones. Right? The anemones sort of are located on coral reefs, and they sort of swim between the fronds of the anemone. And if in a particular area where there's a female defending an area and males orbiting it, if the female is removed, very often a male will transition into being female and take over her place. So these clownfish tend to show sort of transitions in a sort of context-dependent and very flexible manner, which would be really nice, I think, if one could just sort of transition, sort of look around and say, there aren't enough people for people to mate with. I'm gonna transition now. So the question of how many genders or sexes there are out there, seems to sort of one would think that there are only two. I've given you examples of multiply sexed animals and species, but by far the norm is that there are two, and the sort of division into two seems to be a constraint that we see predominating only among multicellular animals. Among unicellular animals, you have a far greater variety. These are paramecia. They're sort of these slipper-shaped unicellular animals. And among paramecia, there are 7 mating types. And a mating type is just whom can you exchange DNA with, which is what these two animals are doing passionately, I hope. So, with several unicellular organisms such as Paramecium and Chlamydomonas over here, you start to see, multiple types of. So, what is defined then as sex for a unicellular animal? Well, it is whom you can mate with, and so it looks like among Paramecia there are 7 different types with different rules about who each of the 7 types can or cannot successfully exchange DNA with. Okay. Chlamydomonas also shows multiple types of sex cells, and this is because several Chlamydomonas sort of these are sort of animals that we think are sort of experimenting with multicellularity, and so they'll get together in groups and sometimes merge and reproduce, and depending on how many of them merge and try to reproduce, they will essentially produce sex cells of along a continuum of sizes and multiple copies of all of the genetic information. So that's it for interesting intersex unicellular creatures and the definition of intersex. But I don't want to dwell on what it means to be intersex among non-unicellular, non-binary and multicellular creatures, right? Because the word unisex has been so heavily pathologized and medicalized and condensed to biology. But I should tell everybody what intersex is, and it's important to say that, I remember when I was in grad school at Harvard, a developmental biology professor of mine didn't know what intersex was, and that's saying something. So, who is intersex and what is intersex is not something that's understood by the large mainstream of professors, of practitioners in psychology and in biology. So this is an example of an intersex puppy. I have a friend with an intersex puppy who's even cuter than this, but I didn't know if I had permission to post that intersex puppy's photo over here. And it's very hard to find a photo of that puppy without my friend's face in it. So, posing next to it. But But the nice thing about, the difficult thing so let me first define what intersex is and then get into what makes it difficult to separate what constitutes intersex and transgender in the animal world. Intersex people are people with variations in their bodies that make it difficult for doctors to classify them as male or female at birth. And a lot of people sort of confuse what it is to be intersex and what it is to be transgender. Transgender is the experience of not identifying with the social gender, right, that you are assigned at birth. And so, as you can tell, transgender is something that involves self-identity and a declaration in some sense of self-identity. And it becomes a little hard to sort of distinguish who is an intersex animal, who is a transgender animal, and who is a queer or gay or lesbian animal that shows gender inappropriate behavior, but very often that's restricted only to sexual behavior, right? So with puppies, there's a really nice way that you can tell, and we know this because we spend a lot of time with puppies. So you know that puppies pee differently depending on what genitals they have, and so my friend's puppy, who has sort of somewhat intermediate genitals, but sort of seems to mostly identify as male because it runs around humping everybody, sits and pees like a girl, right? So this is an intersex puppy, and distinguishing between, therefore, sort of what one would call transgender behavior which does not sort of conform to a biologist or a doctor's expectation of behavior after sort of clinically looking at the body of an animal or of a human being, in equally dehumanizing ways, can be difficult to distinguish. And there are a very small number of non-sex related sexually dimorphic behaviors that one can use to distinguish whether an animal seems to identify as a gender or perform behaviors that are non-sexual that are not in consonance with their sort of apparently visible biological sex. Okay, so among human beings, there's a very wide range of intersex variations, and there are two serious issues which the intersex community usually face. Just to clarify, there is sort of overlap and intersection between intersex, transgender, and queer, broadly speaking, identities. An intersex person is usually, even though their bodies are hard to classify medically, will be, by some sort of nosy doctor, sort of assigned one gender or the other. And parents will usually want to raise the kid in one gender or the other and go to doctors sort of anxiously asking them what to do. So doctors usually assign a gender, and that gender is usually female, because doctors usually say, oh, we'll just chop off whatever's there and make it look like. And it's easier to chop off than to add. And so most intersex kids are brought up as female. There's a lucky small minority of intersex people whose parents leave them alone and don't intervene surgically. And the intersex community has been very clear that this message go out in no uncertain terms to everybody. If you have an intersex child, or if you know someone who has an intersex child, leave them alone, right? Do not interfere medically or surgically until the child is old enough to say what they prefer. You can't look at somebody's intersex variation and say what gender identity that person might want to take on. There isn't a clear or a one-to-one correlation, and so you really just have to wait for people to tell you what they prefer. So some people will, by chance, identify with the gender that was assigned to them at birth. So some intersex people who are assigned female at birth say, all right, I mean, I identify as female, that's fine by me. And so then they are cisgender or non-transgender and intersex, right? There can be people who don't identify with the gender that was assigned to them at birth, and then they will be transgender and intersex, okay? And then sexuality is another question altogether. It's a question of whom you're attracted to, which also is defined with respect to who you think you identify as. And if you identify outside a gender binary, then some of the terms of gay or lesbian identification become too reductive. And so some transgender people some intersex people will identify as straight or as queer or as gay or as lesbian, depending on their own gender identity and the gender identity of people they might be attracted to. And there's no necessary confluence of all of these different identities. Okay, so we'll get back to animals. So one of the books that I really like and which I'm going to recommend to all of you is a book by Joan Roughgarden. And Joan Roughgarden is a trans woman and a biologist at Stanford. And she's one of three trans people on the Stanford faculty who are trans. One of the others, Ben Barris, is also a feminist trans man who's done a lot of writing on on biology and on the trans experience. And Joan's written a book called Evolution's Rainbow, which has some of this stuff in it, and it's a good resource for all of you to have, and I've recommended it as a resource to Ish. But Joan likes to define being male just as producing small sex cells, sperm, and being female as producing large sex cells, i.e. eggs. Okay? And we'll go into why no other definition really works, right? And so what we find when we say that there is some kind of gender binary that is the dominant model in multicellular organisms, all we mean is that once you're multicellular, and you need to mate with somebody else, you can't necessarily exchange DNA with the whole of you, because that can be, fusing each of your cells in this sort of multi-layered body with each of the cells in somebody else's multi-layered body, nice as it sounds, might be quite difficult. So then you have to specialize and produce a subset of cells which will do the fun part for you, and then those tend to be, of two types, one larger, one smaller. We call the ones that produce the small sex cells male, and the ones that produce the large sex cells female. Okay? As I said, the number of sexes does have several variants away from two. Among protozoans, which are single-celled non-bacteria, and fungi and alga, you will often have multiple same-sized sex cells. And so these can constitute mating types, as I've shown you in Chlamydomonas and Paramecia and so on. You can also have multiple sex cell sizes in one fruit fly, that is Drosophila bifurcata, and it produces 3 sizes of sperm. Okay? The largest sperm that it produces is also the largest sperm in the world. And you've all seen fruit flies, right? Those little things that sometimes land on rotten bananas. Yes. So those are the ones that produce the largest sperm in the world. I'm not talking about relative size, I'm talking about absolute size. And the largest is 20 times the male size. I'm going to give you a look at this enticing sperm shortly. And the testis is sort of 1% of the animal's full weight. And producing this massive sperm, it takes a lot of energy. And so this animal is not releasing 1,000 sperm to go forth and find the egg. 1 sperm is economically offered to 1 egg. And the females can then store the sperm and control which sperm fertilizes her. And she can store sperm from multiple males. And female selection, not just in fruit flies, but in several insects, involves sperm collection and then sort of booting out various kinds of, undesirable sperm. And males also then sometimes, sort of fight back in this complex war. And then after they sort of deposit their sperm contribution, they'll put what's called a plug in there, which is just basically a bundle of goo to try and prevent other males from, getting through all of it and scraping past it and then trying to find out where do I go, and so it's just a way to kind of throw off the competition. And so this is very common practice among female insects. So this is, that's a blown up version from the underside of a fruit fly. And just to give you an idea of how small a fruit fly is, on the bottom right, you can see the fruit fly on someone's thumb. The fruit fly is pretty small, right? It's roughly a millimeter long. And the sperm is about 5 millimeters, half a centimeter. That's a big sperm, right? And that thing that you see laid around it is the uncoiled sperm, okay? And when it's coiled, you can see it on the top right. It's because it's packed inside that little fruit fly, so it's kind of coiled round and round and round and round and then sort of jam-packed in there. And it's when it's unraveled that it is that long. This is what it looks like when it's sort of packed inside the female's reproductive duct, where she's storing it for when she decides she wants to make use of it. So, we know that it is possible for males to have multiple sperm sizes, but this isn't really a violation of sort of the multicellular, 2 gamete sizes rule. But we will find that every other rule that we think of as being definitional to what is male and what is female gets violated in the animal kingdom with more regularity than this. One could imagine that size defines male and female. So in the insect world, again, this is very far from true because females are usually larger than males. These aren't insects, these are spiders. But one of the reasons I bring up spiders is that, I think with not just spiders, but several kinds of insects, this size is also something that works to the female's advantage. And so in the sexual interaction, the female is very much the dominant partner. I'm going to show you the non-gruesome female dominant sexual interaction in this slide, and a really gruesome female dominant sexual interaction in the next one. So that's the male on the right, on my right, your right. And that's the sort of large female. And of course, the reason that females are larger than males among insects is because they're carrying a ton of eggs, right? And that makes you heavy. And the males are just carrying these really small, sperm. So they're small too. And so the female sitting on her web, and the male has to approach her with extreme caution. Because the female thinks that things that have landed in her web are food, right? And so he needs to be really careful and really sort of signal clearly that he is not food. Okay? So he gets onto the web and he turns to music. So he tries 2 things. He's a guitarist and he's a drummer. So he plucks on the web, okay? And the plucking sort of sends her little vibrational signals that tell her that this is not just some, piece of food that's sort of thrashing around in the web, but, it's a sophisticated, interested party. And who knows how to speak the language of love, right? So he strums and approaches, strums and approaches, strums and approaches. And if his strumming is convincingly not prey-like, she won't eat him. But if it is, she will. Really. And then once he approaches her, she may or may not want to have some small thing scampering all over her large abdomen. And so he has to then start drumming on her back. And again, if he's good, she'll sort of say, well, I'm enjoying the drumming. And if he's not good, then again, he can wind up his dinner. At least in the next species, even though it's, the outcome of this interaction is much more gruesome, his prospects aren't affected.
The femme fatale in question is the European praying mantis. The smaller male courts his partner carefully. She can literally make a meal of any male. But he has to mate to pass on his genes. In this gruesome embrace, her love bite is the last thing he knows. But even this trauma doesn't seem to unnerve him. He continues to mate as though nothing has happened. Losing his head over a female helps nourish his future offspring. Astonishingly, decapitation even improves his performance. A tiny brain in his rear keeps him active. This macabre coupling can last a day. Even then, the discarded carcass doesn't give up readily.
Okay, one would think that another thing that defines males is penises, right? I mean, I know that all of you were thinking, this is starting to sound a bit ideological. Nobody's talking about sort of the obvious thing, the penis. So there is, do you see something that looks like a penis? Yeah, maybe? Well, you know, these are hyenas, so you can safely assume that what one animal is sniffing at is the other animal's penis. You see that? Okay, so that's the female, and her penis, or her clitoris, is larger than the male's penis. This poses some complications, because it's also very sort of tied up with her vagina, and so when she gives birth, she kind of gives birth through it, which is, yeah. I see the scared looks on everybody's face. Yeah, I know. I know. But not only does she have a penis, it's not just like it's hanging around, you know, being large. She actually uses it. So females are dominant in hyena society, and her penis gets erect when she is signaling her dominance. So her erect penis sort of conveys a social signal about dominance, and submissive animals will then sort of notice it and pay attention and then groom her and sort of signal their submissiveness to her by acknowledging it. And so this is essentially what that kind of looks like. That's her uterus, that's her ovary below, that's her urinary bladder below that, and then that's what extends out into her enlarged clit. You could also think that lactation is something that is, female specific, but we know several examples actually of lactating males, and this dayak fruit bat, which is found in Borneo and Malaysia, is an example of a lactating male. Okay? I once had somebody say, giving birth is the definitive female experience. Yeah, so I'm going to show you seahorses, of course. But seahorses are not unique. So several animals deposit their jointly produced babies in a pouch on the male, and then the male nests them and then spews his sort of ruptures his pouch at some point, and then spews sort of a large load of really sort of miniature looking seahorses, some of which you can kind of see over there, maybe with low light. Do you see those? Yeah, they're very cute. So birth is certainly not a definitive experience of femaleness or of small and large. It's not necessarily correlated with the size of gamete that you're producing, right? A lot of males among nesting birds, also, it is usually males who do parental care for the brood. The other thing one might tend to think is that, even when sex does not change or does not transition over an animal's life point, one tends to think of sex as being some really important core sort of defining identity of a particular organism, right? Whether it changes over their lifetime or not. Among most reptiles, this includes turtles and crocodiles and lizards, temperature is really what determines which sex you're born at. And so a female can also control the sex ratio of her offspring by deciding the temperature of the area where she will lay her eggs. Okay? Now we come to the real meaning of pride. about lions is that they have these really huge, sex-specific manes, right? And so it becomes really easy to tell when it's, boys and boys and not boys and girls. So this was filmed at Kruger, and then people said, oh, but they're in a zoo, they have nobody else for company, so they're having sex with each other. And then there have been several other clips of sort of wild, and this is of course like a proper sort of complete with disco music gay club. There were 3 of them. They were having a great time. Clearly, if you're really desperate for one, you wouldn't necessarily choose to have another. And so I think there was some choice involved there. But certainly there are a lot. I mean, I considered sort of doing a slideshow of all of the queer animals out there, and then I just gave up because there are so many. And so same-sex sexual behavior, which is really easy to tell, right? The difficult thing is telling non-sexual, sex sort of indicating behavior in animals. And the other thing that's very, very rare to find, because intersex typology is really, really rare among all species, that's hard to find. But just as with humans, the fraction of animals that you'll find in any population that shows same-sex behavior is just huge. In some species, it can be sort of nearly universal, and in other species, it's a minority affair. Just to underscore the point, I'll give you a sort of sense of the range. Obviously, there are lots and lots of gay and queer and lesbian fish and flamingos and birds and other kinds and penguins. These are seed beetles, and these are gay male seed beetles mounting each other. And here are the lesbian seed beetles mounting each other. And so seed beetles are a nice, robust system where you'll get lots and lots of same-sex behavior if you just pick a random bunch of seed beetles, so they're a good system to work on. A recent meta-study looked at 110 species of insects and spiders, and as I said, they found that in some species, over 85% of males showed same-sex behavior. And the species that I work on, I'm not the species, but sort of the family that I work on, which is crickets and bush crickets, the ones that sort of call at night, have also joined the League of officially recognized queer animals with a recent paper whose title I somewhat objected to, but it said same-sex behavior and mistaken gender identity in Tediogryllus oceanicus. So I'm just happy that my the species that I work on have finally come out. Lest one think that this is, only limited to, I've already told you that mammals are really boring compared to most other, but not when it comes to queer sex. This is our first pioneering sort of gorilla, known example of gorilla lesbian sex, and there's subsequently been a very, very large amount of literature on queer sex in macaques. Again, why have 2 when you can have 3? Makes no sense. And chimps, bonobos. I know, I was trying to be really scientific and only show you actual pictures of sex, because otherwise people will say, you're being anthropomorphic. Just because it's making a kissy face doesn't mean this is love. This could be, and it is probably just a picture of friends. But then I decided to stop being so raunchy. There's a space for love. I just put this up here because I really like the black swan, and these are black swans that are gay. Okay, what about straight people? What about straight sex? Come on. Okay, this is just a slide to prove that oral sex, which exploded in the scientific world in a description of bat sex. I think, as always, the fellatio paper came out first and the cunnilingus paper came out second. But yes, so I think the lights are too bright for you to notice. But yes, turn them down. So actually, this is something you can see for yourself, because if you've ever seen, there we go, that's the face. if you find ever a roost of bats, you'll realize that when they come back home to roost, there's like a lot of these are fruit bats, a lot of chatter, a lot of moving around, a lot of coupling, and basically they're all having lots of sex. And a good proportion of the time, and if you want to know exactly what proportion, you can read the paper, sort of penetrative sex is preceded by oral sex, and the paper says because it facilitates better copulation, which is something that I could have told them as well. So yes, I'm not someone who to tend to harp about Article 377 for multiple reasons, but we'll go there. Here's what I have to say. 377 is about all forms of quote-unquote unnatural sex. Now, this part sort of throws that into question because obviously, the only thing that seems to be really unnatural about, the only unnatural sexual activity that I can think of is, let me try and not sort of go counter to sort of the safe sex seminar, right? But essentially, there are lots of things that we do that involve particular objects and sex which may be unnatural. I think having sex on beds is probably really unnatural, and I think it should be criminalized at once. It disturbs me and so, I think that I believe strongly. Several people know I have a somewhat unusual approach to 377. I think 377 should be taken very seriously and implemented to the full letter and spirit of perhaps not the spirit, just the letter, right? So I told you what's natural. Now we'll go and find what is unnatural about human sex, and we shall criminalize it. And we shall be in every bedroom criminalizing this unnatural behavior because it does not belong, I think, in the kind of human society we want. So Article 377 obviously affects straight people, and anybody who has any sex that has been described so far and more, any sex that they've essentially seen animals have, all of that falls within the ambit of the natural sex that 377 aims to, or at least that the latest judgment aims to criminalize. I think there's a lesson in this for the queer movement, certainly. There's been a lot of history of the queer movement sort of emphasizing, what, sort of questioning what is natural and what is unnatural. But I think it's also important not to be too defensive about it, because, it's not as if the letter of the law in any way actually criminalizes us if we want to assert that fact. My impression of most of my time in the queer movement, especially in the context of India, is that the law is not what it is, but the law is what you make of it, right? Law enforcement is fairly weak in the country, and that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? The good part of it is that if you are organized and if you are active, the law becomes, in some sense, what you push it to be, right? And if you're at the receiving end of a power spectrum and not at the dominant end of a power, structure, then it's that much harder, and you need that many more people to push. But it doesn't change the fact that the law is what you make of it, and this is something that I think that the way that 377 as a sort of a legal issue should have been handled would have been to sort of just tackle it legally and to not try and make the case that it specifically targets LGBT people, because even if that is its intent, I think the campaign should have been run in a way to have really shown how ridiculous this was, so that it was obvious to everybody. And I think it's important not to run a media campaign when your mobilization on the ground amid all of the people whom you know in your day-to-day life isn't ready, that has to come first. And when you're sure of your base, that's when you have to start mobilizing the media. And I think that the 377 campaign made a mistake with this, and you actually will see that prior to the 377 campaign, there were no prosecutions under the law. There still have been no convictions under the law for consensual gay sex or queer sex, there was a lot of harassment that happened, with 377 cited as part of the reason, but there was so much more harassment that happened with no reason to cite the law at all, right? Queer couples would get picked up in parks and in public bathrooms and everywhere, regardless of whether the cops happen to know the numbers 377 or not, right? And this is something that all of us in the working class queer and trans movement have always known, right? When the police want hafta, they will come. You have to find a way to pay them extra, and that's the realm in which all of this gets settled. The law doesn't enter it at all. If the policeman knows of 377 or doesn't know of 377, it makes very little difference. Trans and queer people are routinely picked up on several other sections of the IPC that can be used. Impersonation, 420, a lot of us get picked up for that. Extortion, when someone's begging. Fair number of people have gotten picked up for that, these are especially trans women. Kidnapping, if you run away with your lover. Everybody gets slapped with kidnapping when they run away with their lover. And any number of other sections. And we all know that when the police exercise brutality upon anybody, they immediately sort of slap sections of intimidating a police officer, of brutalizing a police officer on whoever they have brutalized. And so it's important to realize the limitation of focusing on just the law, instead of tackling the institution of how the law is implemented, the structure of the police, the question of who the police work for, the question of whether the law and the state are actually implementing a system of justice or implementing sort of a structure of dominance. So the other sort of, I think I'm done with everything. Oh, okay. Well, we'll just take a little jab at monogamy because we should, and then I'll get back to a couple of other things that I think are important lessons for all of us in the queer movement. So we all know how monogamy is sort of a prized institution among human beings, and it's it's one thing to say that monogamy is not natural, out of a sense of flippancy, but certainly monogamy is very rare in the animal world, strict monogamy, because unstrict monogamy is not monogamy, right? So this is why we're so fond of swans, because they actually do pair for almost life, and of course, gay, straight, as I showed you earlier. There is the occasional pair-bonded mammal, and there was quite a stir when the prairie vole, meadow vole story came out. So this is the prairie vole. This is a monogamously coupled family with good values. That's the wild child. That's the meadow vole. And the meadow vole is extremely promiscuous and polygamous and so on. And a scientist went about trying to see whether the I'm sorry, whether they could straighten out the meadow voles. They did actually succeed. So essentially, it was found that in parts of the brain that code for reward, if there is sort of a feedback from hormones, particular hormones, and their receptors, from neurons that bear receptors for certain hormones into the reward system, then one can sometimes find the emergence of pair bonding, and this is a relatively rare system that one finds. And so essentially, in this case, the hormone is called vasopressin. In females, in this particular species, the equivalent hormone is called oxytocin, and it's kind of messy and very edible sounding because it's the same hormone involved in pair bonding with a mate, pair bonding with a child, etc. So, of course, probably operating on different circuits in the brain. Definitely operating on different circuits in the brain. So, what this person did was to try and take the vasopressin receptor and pop it in the same, get it to be expressed in the same parts of the brain as was found in the prairie vole. And ta-da! The meadow vole with an overexpression of the receptor for vasopressin started to prefer a single partner over others. And so, this was interesting. I mean, apart from the slight annoyance that they turned the meadow voles, into a monogamous animal instead of the other way around. That apart, it was interesting because it suggested that things that are generally loaded with notions of morality and so on could be something that could essentially be genetically based. And this then becomes as legitimate as anything else when one says, it's in my genes, I didn't do it. I mean, not that with any sort of thing for which one has discovered a genetic basis, one rules out the notion of choice or of agency, but the idea is that this is then something one can't place 100% within the realm of I should be able to control this, or I should want to control this, or control necessarily being something that is exercised upon natural variation. Okay, so I'm going to end there and just say a couple more things about what I think this tells us about the movement. Apart from telling us what, that there's sort of the construct of what is natural and what is unnatural is nonsense, it also tells us that queerness and transness and all of these things have always been there, right? And that's another important thing I think we should remember when we go forward in what's called the queer movement. Because what defines itself as the queer movement is largely seen as something that has emerged post-90s, post-globalization. This is part of the reason that people mistakenly see this as a Western import. The fact that a lot of organizations that work on this and are most visible on this are funded by Western agencies. All of these things are cited to suggest that these are sort of Western imports, that these are things that are not well known or well established in India. Now we already know, thankfully, we've had a very robust system of, a very old system of organization that has existed among working class trans and queer communities, with a particular sort of structure that defies the categories that have been imposed on it by the post-globalization NGOs. And that structure mostly consists of trans women and men whose gender identity ranges on a spectrum of femininity, where that femininity can be defined and self-identified as I am a queer, I'm a gay man who is interested in other men, and because I'm a person interested in men, that makes me a woman. To, this is not about whom I'm interested in having sex with, but I identify as feminine. To I identify as female, I would like to transition physically so that my body matches my sense of gender identity. And that full range is included in this community. The only exclusion from this community, in some sense, is of people who identify as male, and then no distinction is made between people who identify as male and want to have sex with women, and people who identify as male and want to have sex with men. The understanding of the working class Hijra and Koti community being that men want to have sex with everything, whether it's male or female or a hole in the wall. Now this may not be... Now that doesn't square up well with the identification of cisgender men who don't necessarily want to identify as feminine by virtue of being attracted to other men. And so this isn't a structure, and a lot of this structure is also, and the structure sort of doesn't automatically include lesbians or trans men in its midst either, and it notionally sort of includes intersex people and sort of actually sends out, a lot of people assume that the Hijra community, for example, is largely consists of intersex people, when in fact it mostly consists of transgender women. This is a remarkable structure that has evolved in the absence of funding, right? In the absence of any form of inclusionary mechanism. There have been modes of inclusion that have been offered by ruling classes and states from time to time, but that has largely done the work of organizing everybody in the community without any form of support, and in the face of sort of widespread exclusion, to the point where in every village people have possibilities of connecting up to this sort of largish community. So I think that for all of us who have identities that fall outside the realm of what has always fallen within this network, I actually believe that it is better for us to move ahead. And we all know that the Hijra community faces a level of stigmatization that is incredible, and a complete exclusion from almost all realms of employment and education as well. So we have two options here, and the dominant, what calls itself the dominant queer movement, tends to take the option of distancing itself from that sort of very old network, and that has advantages because you're sort of distinguishing yourself from a stigmatized identity. But it also has the disadvantage of appearing to be a very new thing, and in the context of funding and globalization, a very Western thing. And so I think that we're all in this together, and I personally think that the sort of historical leadership and the network of the Hijra community, I find that to be a network with far more liberatory potential for the vast majority of people who would be called LGBT in India, because one, it places stigmatization right, front and center, and it does not sort of seek rights for a small subset of the LGBT community, but sort of places the most stigmatized identity front and center and says, we've always been here, right? But you've always been exclusionary, and there have always been forms of exclusion. There have also always been forms of inclusion, and instead of seeing sort of the world on a trajectory of increasing LGBT liberation, can we understand that just as there have always been queer and trans and gender fluid animals, there have always been queer and trans and gender fluid people, and our liberation has moved up and down in waves, not necessarily in a singular trajectory of getting better or getting worse. And can we then unite with everybody who is fighting very often at the level of survival on a day-to-day basis in order to ensure that at least now we create a space that is liberatory for all of us. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.